Has your organization done any research into this? What do you guys have to say about that?
We think it's utter nonsense.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. We are very excited to bring you tonight's episode because we have a very special guest joining us tonight, David Leese.
David is currently the Vice President of Development and Engagement at the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, or FCPP, a think tank based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Welcome to Northern Perspective, David.
It is an honor to join you, Fox and Cypher.
Excellent. Well, the honor is ours, and we wish we could actually give credit to the person that brought us together, but I think that would violate some sort of privacy, or at least it would make them extremely uncomfortable. So, yeah. But just let them know that we really appreciate it. So,
well, I will do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So, David, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to work for the FCPP?
Well, it's been a long, delightful journey. To make a long story short, I've been involved even since I was a child in the realm of politics and public policy, as well as in business at a senior level, as well as I was the CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. I was a mayor in the area for a number of years. I have really had the honor to be involved in a lot of things. I even worked at Queen's Park for a while in Ontario, but then I did move as part of my work as a senior leader in education to the great province of Manitoba. And that was delightful. I worked as a senior vice president at Red River College, one of the large polytechnics. And then I ended up, for a number of reasons, going to British Columbia, where I'm based now. And so I have always lived this kind of integrative life between academe, the private sector, and of course, the political realm. And so that's just part of the DNA of our family, is to be involved in our community.
Yeah, it's something that we're learning is ingrained in the DNA of our family as well. But we accidentally discovered that this year, so we can definitely relate to some of that. And for those that are unfamiliar, the FCPP is commonly called a think tank. So what is a think tank?
Well, that's a great question. A think tank is really one of those kind of special bodies that really devotes its work to thinking of usually better ideas in public policy to help governments make better decisions. And think tanks have their different flavors or kind of foundational principles or even ideologies that may anchor them. In our case, we're in a really quite an astounding family of think tanks that came out of the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, England after World War II. And we're very much about open markets, but really very much nonpartisan. We think there's a principled approach to better public policy, whether it's, fancy words such as subsidiarity and the notion that we should try to put power as close to the people as possible. Imagine that. Mm-hmm. So there's very important principles that make for better decision making. And the brutal reality is that today a lot of decisions are not based on good public policy. They're really decisions masquerading under the guise of public policy. They're really following some type of polls or someone's harebrained scheme from someone who's never run anything in their life, to put it bluntly.
Gee, who could you be talking about?
Sorry, what's that?
So, gee, who could you be talking about?
Well, you know what? I could be talking about many people.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And, it's kind of a sad commentary. So, like, when we say we're nonpartisan, we really do mean that seriously. Obviously, a lot of our alignment tends to happen with parties that are on the, quote, conservative side. But we're not blind. Through human history, you have, one of our heroes is Sir Roger Douglas, the great finance minister, a Labour finance minister in New Zealand of all times, where New Zealand was hitting the wall, and they came up with some brilliant public policy to this day that Canada would be wise to very much dig into and learn from those lessons. So we're there really trying to bluntly advocate for better public policy that serves Canadians. Imagine that. And that would be, there's exciting opportunities for this country. This is an amazing country. But I think that we are ham-fisted by our leadership, and we undermine really our own future by the inability to pursue those good policies. And we don't try to sound like we know it all. We don't, but we can learn a lot from other jurisdictions. So we want to be a resource there for elected officials who have a difficult job.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what are the goals or the purpose of the FCPP right now?
Well, right now we are focused very much on a whole series of public policy areas. So we comment not only on current issues, but we are also advocating for a variety of roadmaps. And we did this under previous times with a variety of governments. The Right Honorable Stephen Harper was rumored, well, he wasn't just rumored, he certainly thought a lot of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. So we certainly did have a significant opportunity to influence a government there. But we also are very much trying to position on issues such as what are the lessons coming out of how COVID was managed. So we worked very closely with the National Citizens Inquiry, with the Honorable Preston Manning. He's certainly a good colleague and friend. We've worked very hard on issues related to privatization, to looking at this myriad list of crown corporations across the country and how they could actually work better or should be privatized. We think there's a lot to work on tax policy and improving local government. We just released a few months ago our Property Rights and Freedom Index, because property rights are really foundational to a high-functioning society, not just economically, but from the point of view of civic society. We've released a lot of incisive analyses around improving healthcare, to education, to housing. That's a big one for us, because housing affordability in certain markets in Canada is a train wreck. And of course, on the environment. And a lot of these issues, Frontier is really stuck to what we think are very important principles. And we're one of the very few in the world that have done that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in some cases, doesn't matter if critics are commenting from the left or the right, if a particular organization, as unbiased as it is, takes a stance just based in facts and common sense, there always seems to be accusations of a partisanship, just because of where it stands. And I think it's unavoidable, because no matter what you do, there's always going to be a stake in the sand on that political spectrum where a particular policy is going to essentially align to. And sometimes it's on the left and sometimes it's on the right. So do you find that that's the case from your experience? And if that is the case, would you agree that if at one point in time, if you have both sides criticizing you, you're probably sitting right in the middle where you should be?
Well, that's a neat question. I think that there's some truth to that, in the sense that if our goal is to elevate the level of thinking, I think that when we are attacked on very superficial, like I was a bit unusual in my family, we were taught the 26 fallacies, logical fallacies. And one of them, of course, is ad hominem attacks.
Yes.
So whenever someone is calling you names, you're onto something. I mean, it's just utterly silly. So if our goal is to elevate the level of thinking, the level of discourse in this country, and God only knows that that is a worthy goal, especially today, then doesn't it beg the question that teams of people like Frontier, who we have an enormous network of just very talented, gifted people who really care about our nation. It says we need them to speak up and speak loudly across this country as we seek to raise awareness and education while we can see what is happening around us. So I take your question as a good one, because we really, one of our models is that we're not afraid, and it's important that we lead with courage and with conviction and principle if we're to make any impact in this crazy world.
And that's actually very similar to how we started our journey, wouldn't you say, Fox?
Yeah, I think so.
Because we were sitting at home and we were seeing Canada quite literally start crumbling around us. And
Is that right? Yeah.
we have our son, and we've made no secret he has special needs and needs a lot of support. And we just couldn't stand by and let that world crumble around him without trying to do something about it. So we decided that we wanted to try it out, start a voice, and see where it got us. And it's in exactly 8 days. It's going to be exactly 1 year for us on YouTube. So
Wow.
So we've gained.
Well, bravo on you for doing that. I can really relate to that, because in my age, and I don't pretend to be that old, but I really feel like it's not about me, it's about the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the problem is this generation, and I think the immediately previous generation, are just so misinformed on how the world is actually functioning that it enables poor decision making, and that's a huge problem because they're basing decisions on a misconstrued version of reality, and it's not based on fact. It's based on conjecture and opinion and ideology.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I would share that concern for sure about the state of our nation. I am a very proud Canadian. I see enormous strengths in this country, but I'm vitally concerned about its future.
And in a lot of ways, that starts with our political parties. So, does the FCPP? Do you look at the different strategies that the political parties are employing, are undertaking? Do you follow the conventions? Do you follow their policy releases? I imagine you do. What has been your what's your take on how the NDP, Liberals, and Conservatives are navigating their policy decisions and their strategy coming into 2024?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer is we do follow these things. We don't follow it necessarily in a micro level, but we do follow the ebb and flow of policy announcements, and we pay attention to kind of what's going on in terms of a variety of issues around how parties are navigating their dynamics as it relates to policy. But we pride ourselves on being nonpartisan. But it's a very interesting set of dynamics. And let's just take the NDP as an example, because it's I'm certainly in my own case very much a student of history. And if we look at the New Democratic Party or its predecessors, the CCF, we see a long history of efforts. It's quite fascinating. The religious reform movement. I think of J.S. Woodworth and so many others that helped found the CCF, and how the NDP today is just so in contrast with its origins. It's really quite a difference. And I certainly know a variety of people in that party, and they would clearly admit it would be difficult for them to do so as much publicly, but they would say their party has really become much more a group, really, it's not so much serving working people, but really more a particular niche within a radical kind of leftist kind of philosophy. And I know I'm generalizing a little bit, but that's kind of the core of the party now, centered on really public sector unions. So that's a reality that really I think is very relevant, because it's a key anchor to understanding where a lot of their policy seems to be coming from, and who they seek to serve. And it's confusing because so much rhetoric is about, serving working people and all the rest. But if you look closely at those policies, it's really for kind of a privileged lot within those public unions. So that would be one example. And I think the Liberal Party has really created, largely through, and I mean, I know that the history of that party very well from its beginnings, but I'd say it's again very much deviated into another kind of area of socialist leftist action, and really, I think a lot of the more traditional, if I can name them, blue liberals, people who really traditionally stood for a stronger private sector. I think of the traditions of even former finance minister and prime ministers Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. Do they really have a home in that party anymore? I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and even touching on that, just how you've talked about how the NDP has evolved. I think it's virtually no secret these days that the typical alignment is the NDP is on, or should be on, the far left, and then the Liberals were, more towards the center, but on the left, and then the Conservative Party is on the right, and then that's kind of how things lined up. But policy-wise, do you think that the Liberals have eclipsed the NDP on the spectrum in terms of how far left they've moved?
I would say that it's pretty darn close. I think it begs the question: why don't they just merge?
Right,
frankly.
Right, because we've heard a former NDP leader, Tom Mulcair, talk about this, and talking about the fact that Justin Trudeau is essentially taking Jagmeet's lunch because he's so far left.
Yes.
He might as well just take the NDP supporters, and obviously that bothers Jagmeet Singh and his party to a degree. So what do? Do they move even further left? How can you? So it's very interesting.
It really is. It's become, and I think, confusing to voters, where there's often a common assumption that the Liberals are kind of the middle. They're not. They're a radical left party now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could go through every policy area in the book, and that's illustrated by that.
And there's when we think about the Conservative Party, when Aaron O'Toole was making his election run, he received a lot of criticism during and afterwards about the fact that the perception of his platform was much more to the center and even to the left, trying to I guess, and entice Liberal voters to the Conservative Party, but in doing so, he ended up losing a lot of Conservative support. Do you agree with that based on his platform? And B, do you think that Pierre Poilievre and the current Conservatives have kind of, realigned the Conservative Party to where it's traditionally been?
Gosh, that's a interesting set of questions. I think the criticism of Aaron O'Toole was justified, in my humble opinion, because there's a base of support within the Conservative Party that were attracted, in my observations, to support Aaron O'Toole because he ran as a kind of a classic, modestly right of center candidate, and then he shifted. So I just know, I mean, I was a former elected official myself. I think you get into trouble when you seem like you may have betrayed the people that you dance to the party with. So I think that was just a very practical issue of your voter coalition, of being seen to forsake that support. And where Pierre Poilievre is now, I'm not so sure if it's really that much different than the previous regimes of the conservative parties. I think that where he's at is also a reflection of the unique times that we're in, where he is facing a government in power that is, we've never seen anything like this. This is probably the most radical leftist government we've ever seen in our history. And its fiscal ineptitude is just breathtaking, as it spends more money than all previous governments combined in our history. I mean, there's decision after decision, whether it's both on international stage, domestic, that is really frittering Canada away. I mean, there's just any measure, whether it's productivity economically with declines there, to the outflow of business capital, to taxation rates that are not competitive. If you've got our reputation on the world stage, how do you tick off not just one superpower between China and India, but also other countries? It's really absurd. What's really kind of I think surreal is that you have an information bubble, an information war that has been upended by the state. Again, this has never been seen, that is really undermining a very important pillar of our democratic tradition and society, and that is the media, where you have the state systematically funding well over 2,000 media outlets, small, medium, and large. And that has, I'm not talking about the vibrant, growing independent media team. I'm talking about the myriad of media outlets that Canadians would be shocked are really significantly funded and really are driven through codes of conduct by this federal government. And that is a huge problem. And that's where the Conservatives have to kind of be principled, but also realistic in terms of how they communicate across that. And I think that's not an easy task.
Yeah, and how they decouple the government from what is supposed to be the independent mainstream media without significantly damaging that media landscape. That's going to be, I think, one of the big challenges that they have. That's if they come into power, which leads us to our next question.
So we've noticed in the House of Commons and, in these media scrums especially, that there seems to be a lot more energy within all the parties. And we sense that there's an election coming. What do you think? Do you think there's an election that might be in 2024?
There's a distinct possibility. I think it's not clear. I think it's like a coin toss. There's definitive pros and cons, and I'll just be very practical about it. The NDP, I think, just announced the other day that they're almost paid off their election debt from the past one. So in order to run elections, you need what is called, money. So that is a challenge for them. And I think also, that a lot of the public polling, this is my perspective in terms of observing and analyzing election results for years, really significantly understates Conservative support across the country. And I say this because some of the polling is pretty small in terms of sample size. I think you've got challenges of reaching typical voters. There's a lot of difficult methodology things. So I don't mean that in some disrespectful way to some of the polling companies. But the reality is that you really have a dilemma here for the Liberals and the NDP. I think their brands are pretty well irreparably broken in the sense that they are wearing the affordability crisis with the Canadian voter now. And so is it better to go earlier than better? Well, I suspect it's only going to get worse as people renew their mortgages at higher interest rates, whether they like it or not. And tragically, I've even heard people, they're starting to lose their homes. Mm-hmm. There's some real tragic situations occurring as people run up to walls of financial problems. And as well as I know, there's a lot of discontent among Canadians. And I hear this anecdotally every day. People are really quite disturbed by what they see around them. And they're only going to lay that at the feet of those governments, those incumbents in power. I think I saw another poll that came out, I think it was just today, an Angus Reid poll that just summarized across the board how Canadians view provinces and their credibility. And I think it's really taken a huge hit as people realize that Canada is kind of on a downward slide. And I'm not inherently a negative person, but I mean this is the brutal reality. So I think every incumbent government has really got to wake up and say, well, is it better to go earlier and frankly save whatever we have? Or is it better to just shove off the inevitable?
Yeah, and that's the interesting question. We've done a lot of work on reasons why there might be an election coming, and you just raised a really important point, which is the affordability crisis and the people that have purchased homes and that are going to be renewing. 2025, I think, is going to be a very, very bad year for the Liberals if it goes that long, because there's so many of these people who bought their homes during COVID at the rock bottom interest rates, were convinced by either themselves or their financial advisors to get a variable rate mortgage, or even if it is a fixed rate mortgage. They are really going to be in for mortgage payment shock next year when all of this comes to bear, right before the scheduled elections. So to your point, it's going to just go from bad to worse for the Liberals, and assuming the NDP ride that out, they're going to wear it just as much, if not more so, because yes, Justin caused the problem with his government, but Jagmeet Singh let it happen. He was the enabler, and his party could have pulled the plug at any time, but didn't. And,
exactly.
But one of the main factors that we're thinking is going to cause an election as early as this spring is the fact that the riding boundary changes are coming into effect in April of this year.
Yes.
And, in addition to adding 6 seats to the House of Commons, 4 of which are projected to go to the Conservatives, with all of those changes, the NDP and the Liberals, frankly, but the NDP are not going to do well, through that riding boundary change. I think they lose. I think it's 2 seats they lose off the bat because they're either eliminated or they're going to be flipping directly to a Conservative proposed, election results. So the way we look at this is just strategically: do you go now where it's bad, or do you go later when it's worse?
Exactly.
And then the upside here is, in our opinion, to go early for Jagmeet, because he at least gets to say, I'm the one who took Trudeau down. I'm the one who stopped this nightmare from happening. And he knows that he's in control here. But the longer this goes, the less people will believe that message. So in addition to a myriad of other things, one of which you bring up money and their challenge. They seem to be on a push for money. As you no doubt heard, they sent out a letter to all of their supporters prior to Christmas saying, we're anticipating a possible spring election, give us money. So there's a lot of different factors that we've rolled into this, but that's our take on it, and it dovetails right off of what you said, which we actually didn't touch on that point. That just adds another reason why we don't think Jagmeet can let this go to 2025.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've outlined a very good kind of an overview of the factors. I'm a big fan of game theory, or prisoner's dilemma. And you can map out a lot of the mathematical models for which players will do what and what they'll advocate. And I think you've mapped out a lot of those key variables. And one that we shouldn't underestimate is the decision making of people's pension plans.
We've considered that, actually. We did consider that.
I know it sounds absurd, but the reality is that a lot of these people, and I really appreciate that people run and serve in these capacities. I mean, for a number of these people, this is the best job they've ever had. Yep. So, but don't underestimate the career risks, in other words, in all these walks of life.
Well, and that's actually one of our arguments for Jagmeet Singh to pull the non-confidence and call an election at minimum in 2024, but especially this spring. We were very intrigued by one of the Nanos polls in December, where they actually had the NDP tied with the Liberals at one point in time.
Yes, I noticed that.
So, we postulated, what if, Justin Trudeau makes it clear that he is going to be leading the Liberal Party into the next election, which he since did. And what if Jagmeet is able to campaign and eclipse the Liberals in seats? What if that is a distinct possibility? Now he's in the position of increasing his salary by 50%, thereby increasing his pension that much more, and he gets another 4 years on top of, or another 3 years on top of what he already had. So we actually took the pension into account when we considered that possibility. So,
well, it's a fascinating discussion, and the other one that's kind of the sidebar to this is Justin Trudeau himself, in the sense that at some point within a party structure, do they see the pathway out of this is to renew by changing out the leader? That probably is one of the few scenarios that would probably could work for them. You should never underestimate their abilities to do that. The problem is I just don't see any viable successor at this juncture. Do you?
No, we completely agree with that. And unfortunately, we think that's by design. It seems like the Liberals, especially Trudeau, has assembled, we'll say, such a weak cabinet that there is really no challenger to him from a charismatic point of view, a presence point of view, or even a notoriety. So like the most notable Liberals right now are Chrystia Freeland, which I don't think anyone would accept as leader of the Liberal Party. Francois Philippe Champagne, same thing. Anita Anand, I think, could be a good player, but I don't think she has the charisma to do it. By all accounts, she seemed to do a serviceable job when she was heading up national defense and was making progress there. But I don't see her as a candidate people would flock to. And then there's Sean Fraser and Mr. LeBlanc. Like, so there's nobody that is strong enough to step in and really take that party to the next level. I think you're going to end up with another interim leader at this point until they get some fresh blood. Now, we've heard, I think Fox read recently that as many as 10 Liberal MPs currently have announced that they're not going to run in the next election. I think that says a lot.
It does, yeah.
Since that's almost 10% of the party so far, and they need new blood, and they need a new leader in there. And I don't think the next effective leader of the Liberal Party is in this government right now.
No, I suspect you're right. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about this party in power right now, I'm a big fan of Donald Savoy. His analysis over the years out of Moncton there was, looking carefully at structures of power and how they've traditionally operated in Canada to better serve the country, and the whole issue of appointment of cabinet positions and capable people. And if you look at this government, there's been a real pattern of appointing people that are almost symbol carriers. They're not really people who bring managerial capacity. And I think that's certainly one of the observations that a friend of mine, the former Minister of Finance, Bill Marneau, commented about. He even did it publicly in his book. It was that was the pattern, is a lot of the ministers really had no managerial background. They were really symbols to make a point of communication. And it's really, so it's kind of a superficial kind of cabinet that doesn't really have, or doesn't appear to have much capability, really.
Yeah, and we've actually commented on that in some of our videos in terms of the competency of these people to run their various departments is just absent. You know, like I will say, you know, as much as I dislike the decisions and even her communication style, you know, Chrystia Freeland does not have the skill set to be the Minister of Finance. Kudos to her to take on that challenge, having, a very vastly different experience, but she's not the pick to do that. Whereas you contrast Pierre Poilievre's finance minister, he's built a business from the ground up, came to Canada with virtually nothing in his pocket, understands the economy, understands a business, understands a budget, and seems very much equipped and competent to take on that job. And that's, I think, the main contrast that I see from the shadow cabinet to the current cabinet was one is based on or picked based on ideology and photo ops, and the other one is based on pure competency. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you look like, it's what can you do.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think that that's a very important observation, Cypher. And I think at Frontier, we're very keenly interested then in not only roadmaps or action plans for the next government, but also the combination of team, because policy is not just simply about policy and ideas, it's about people. And you need serious people taking the mantle for the next government that will get the job done. And so this is a very important set of work activities that must be done before the next election.
So one of the things that you mentioned is that the FCPP is focused on the affordability crisis, which, from what we see in our comments, Canadians are certainly focused on as well.
When we talk about related to the affordability crisis, it's something that I'm coming across regularly with people, and that is just a utter disgust with the inability to do basic transportation. People's budgets are pretty tight, like between the grocery store. And because I host this program, Leaders on the Frontier, I do get approached by people from time to time in public places, and they just say, well, thank you for doing this discussion. And I ask them for feedback. And it's amazing how people, like last week in the grocery store, there was a woman who just said, I'm just so frustrated that I look at something I would normally buy and it's 4 times what I would normally expect. So that puts people in a particular position. And then I go a few months ago into my credit union, and in the credit union, there's a teller I've known for years. And she says, David, this is my last week I'm going to be here, and it's been nice to get to know you. And I said, well, why is that? She said, well, I figured out that based on all these tax hikes on my gas, that I used to fill up, e.g. carbon taxes, it doesn't make any sense for me to commute about a half an hour. And I think that, I say these as anecdotal stories, but they're so true because we all resonate with them. Like that, if you're paying out several $100s more in expenses every month, I don't care what you call it, a carbon tax or whatever. I mean, we all know it's going into general revenues, and it's not going to help the environment one whit. So this is the game that people are waking up. The whole slice and dice thing with the carbon tax geographically, so that the Atlantic provinces would somehow get a rebate if you used heating oil, is absurd. You can't justify that. It's just pure politics. So I think that's when the light of day shines on that, then you're in trouble.
What's the FCPP's stance on this, and what can be done? What do you guys think can be done about it?
Like on the affordability crisis and really as it relates to the carbon tax?
Well, there's many, many exciting things that we could do to make life for Canadians better and more affordable. But right off the top, the carbon tax is a great example. It needs to be scrapped immediately. It is an utter sham. It is penalizing every Canadian who uses energy. Historically in Canada, affordable, reliable energy has been one of our ace cards to not only living an affordable life, but to our economic competitiveness. And so the carbon taxes are a ruse. They're so-called, it's about the government in power would claim that it's about taxing pollution. Well, nonsense. Carbon dioxide is not a pollution. It is an essential part of human life. One of our senior fellows, Dr. Patrick Moore, who's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, eloquently summarizes this. Not too far from my home are massive greenhouses under glass that pump carbon dioxide into the plants. And everybody knows this. So this whole so-called scientific theory about climate alarmism, where Greta Thunberg wags her thumb or her finger, pardon me, at us, is just utterly absurd. We know that this is not true. And we've been dragged along this pathway of these carbon taxes, the way that the government gets more money, and as it continues to expand the size of the government. The biggest accomplishment of the Trudeau government to date has been the scale of growth of the federal government and its intrusion in every provincial and even local jurisdiction. So the carbon tax is utter nonsense, but there's many other ways that we can improve affordability for Canadians.
And
sorry, I had a question.
Oh, yeah, go for
it. So the Liberal government is currently claiming that 8 out of 10 families will get more money back from the carbon tax than they are paying. Has your organization done any research into this? What do you guys have to say about that?
We think it's utter nonsense. The reality is that the taxes are loaded up on everything that moves. And so when Canadians think they're getting a check back, they are, there's another hand that's increasing the costs on everything else they buy. If you're a Canadian that's normal, and if you go to the grocery store and buy products from the farm, whether it's manufactured, all these things are loaded up with carbon taxes. So when they talk about a rebate, that's very modest compared to the overall net cost of these taxes as it dominoes right across the economy. And that's what people don't realize, this so-called just transition bill is going to immeasurably change the quality of life for Canadians. The carbon taxes are just starting in terms of the level that they want to be at. And this is all in contradiction to the promises that they've made. So we think it's bad public policy because it's actually hurting working people, and it's making Canada much more less competitive. What's the point of loading up on carbon taxes and then getting your carbon rebate check if you're unemployed?
Well, and that's just it. We were speaking with our viewers on our live stream on Sunday about an idea for a campaign that Fox had, which was, let's take a look at everybody's heating bills and gas bills and see exactly how much it does cost and compare that against your rebate. We started taking a look at our heating bills. We're heated by natural gas, and about 23% of our natural gas bill is the federal carbon tax. And that went up by 35% since December of 2022.
And
Case in point.
Not only that, we're paying HST on top of it. So we're paying tax on a tax. Yeah.
So, and that is supposed to go up, to a factor of almost 4 times by 2030. So, even heating with environmentally friendly, quote unquote, natural gas, you're still being penalized for that. And to your point, the only places that the Liberal government talks about the carbon tax being is at the pumps and on food, because that's where the Conservatives are really bringing the focus to. But to your point, Canadians don't understand that your clothes have a carbon tax on it, your toilet paper has a carbon tax on it. Every single product you go out and buy has a carbon tax on it because it's been on a truck at some point. And,
exactly.
And if it's made in Canada, then there's carbon taxes all along the way. So there is no chance in Trudeau's Canada that the money that you're actually getting back is eclipsing, because it's a mathematical impossibility, what you're actually paying into it. And there's no end to it. Okay, so fine. Canadians are paying carbon tax on home heating. When does that stop, Trudeau? What's the replacement for natural gas for home heating? You're going to give everybody heat pumps? I don't think so.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's just a really bad policy, and in our opinion, he made the biggest mistake that he possibly could regarding the carbon tax, which was the carve out of home heating oil. Because if his carbon tax was functioning as he said it did, these people don't have anything to worry about from an affordability perspective, because they'd be getting more money back, so that would cover
That's right.
what their costs are. But
Yeah, good point.
but he ended up saying, well, we understand that they're feeling the pinch, and we understand that it's really expensive, so we're going to give them an exemption. And it's like, no, hold on. You just said that they were getting more than they were paying out. So why would you need to do that from an affordability perspective? And he completely showed his hand, and that's where the Conservatives, the NDP, and everybody else just pounced on him.
Yeah, and rightly so. So I think this government has barked up a tree of instituting all kinds of decisions, as I said earlier, that really are not viable public policy. They're not policies rooted on good practice or reality, but they're really delusional. And this is where a lot of these things are hitting the reality of the road, and they're just going to ruin our country, really. And people are rightly feeling the pain around these asinine decisions. I know that's a crude word in this context, but I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, it really is ridiculous. And I think the thing that bothers me the most, at least, is that it seems like the government is misinforming Canadians about what this tax does and how much money they're getting back.
Right.
Have you noticed, like in your work, is there any misunderstandings, like general misunderstandings that you think Canadians might have about the carbon tax or how it functions?
Well, I think a fundamental premise is that so many Canadians, there's been a strong drumbeat of this message, whether it's been in schools, whether it's been on the public media, that somehow we're entering an existential crisis when it comes to the environment. And I'm very fortunate that at Frontier we have a large network of people, scientists around the world, and this is just simply not the case. There's a vigorous debate regarding our environment. And, I, like you, care deeply about the environment. But this whole idea that somehow us taking a bus versus driving a car, or somehow these carbon taxes are the solution to creating a utopian green planet, is utterly insane as these people jet off in their private jets to the next climate change summit in Scotland or Timbuktu, is just utter nonsense. And I think that this is where we have to kind of confront these so-called narratives. The left always talks about narrative. Well, let's talk about facts. The facts are that they're pushing massive changes to people's lifestyle and the future of their children based on arguably less than 1 degree of temperature change over 80 years. And even if Canada were to shut down everything tomorrow as a functioning economy, it would make no difference whatsoever in terms of their own loony environmental models. So this is the reality that people, as Canadians, we're trying to communicate with people more, is that they don't realize the absurdity of this debate and the pretext and the excuse that this is used as the basis to implement massive changes to people's lives. It's totally wrong.
Yeah, and that really aligns with one of the arguments that we make to this. And we try and approach this from a non-ideological standpoint. And we approach it like this: is even if you believe that humanity is 100% causing all climate change on the planet right now,
Yes.
and it's related to the carbon footprint. Okay, let's just assume that's true. You don't have to believe it, but let's assume it is. When you look at the carbon footprint of all countries on the planet, I always direct people back to the Pareto principle, where if you look at the percentage of Canada's carbon footprint, and you've already alluded to this, it's around 1.6 to 1.8% of global emissions. Then you have the China, the United States, and India that account for about 50% of global emissions. So if you were to completely eliminate all carbon emissions in Canada tomorrow, To your point, it will make literally zero difference because China, on an annual basis, is increasing their carbon footprint more than ours is for one entire year. So,
Exactly. Yep.
so unless you get China, the United States, and India to significantly lower their carbon footprint, it's all in vain, all of these policies that you're trying to implement in Canada just to try and make yourselves feel good. And the
I
net
agree.
and the net effect is you're causing this affordability crisis. You've not destroying, you've destroyed the middle class. And as a result of that, in the next 5 years, our economy is going to be in real trouble. And we're already starting to see the signs of it slowing down, with the Bank of Canada starting to ring the alarm bells right after Chrystia Freeland has been out there talking about, oh, we're seeing great growth in our economy and our debt to GDP ratio is great. Never mind the fact that even on that note, Fox discovered that they're including the CPP in that debt to GDP ratio, which is very dishonest for them to even use that. And, for everybody listening, what that means is the government is looking at their total assets, inclusive of your CPP and everybody else's CPP in their assets when they're measuring that against debt. And that's not theirs, that's yours. That's your money. It's not the government's. So if you take away the CPP, we do not have the biggest or the best debt to GDP ratio in all the G7. We have one of the worst. So you cannot solve the world's climate problem with a silly little carbon tax. It's just, to your point, it's asinine.
I totally agree, Cypher and Fox, what you've outlined. And so it really concerns me. I guess part of the takeaway of this is that at Frontier, we're very concerned by kind of the lack of thoughtful insight when it comes to these policies based on real data and evidence. These are major decisions, not only for ourselves, but for every Canadian. And I think that it begs the question, what kind of attitude does it take for decision makers like this, that they are so arrogant to believe that they are entitled and it is their somehow duty to impose these kinds of massive changes on the lives of people, let alone the next generation, like to spend the level of debt that we have, as you've outlined, and to lay that burden on the next generation. It raises significant moral questions as well, in my book. And this is part of the reason why I think a lot of people, certainly in our team, are very motivated to work so hard at these issues, because they just look at this and say, this is so wrong.
Yeah, and as a think tank, what would FCPP say about like what policies or what ideas do you have to protect the environment or to help with climate change? Because I know that a lot of Canadians really do care about climate change. They're afraid of it. They're concerned about it. So what's your policies around that?
Well, there's many. I think if we had to summarize it up, we would reference, and you can see this on Frontier's website, there's a lot of emphasis on what is called smart green. So when we look at all kinds of solutions to energy, as an example, we should try to put them on an even playing field. We shouldn't subsidize anything. So for instance, if we look at solar energy or wind power, we know that there's a lot of problems with them. They're intermittent, they're not reliable. They're distributed energy. In other words, when you put up a field of windmills, they require all kinds of lines out to every individual one. And so they require a lot more energy, not only in terms of collection of that power, but also in terms of manufacturing all those things. And all those things are based on oil and gas ultimately. So it's a bit delusional to say that it's green energy, because it's really a subsidy game.
Yeah, and it's almost
and
a net
everybody
loss.
knows this. Pardon me?
It's almost a net loss. And to your point, the only use for solar and wind power now, unfortunately, is supplementary energy production. It can't be a primary source.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm not, at Frontier, we would say we're not against we're not against solar and wind per se, but they should be looked at from a kind of a, dare I say, common sense point of view, that you don't have subsidy, and you look at it in a smart way that says, well, in this case, it would make sense to say put a solar panel on your cottage, great, but don't subsidize it. The other side to this is that with oil and gas, we have an incredible opportunity in our country to develop it in an ethical way. We have already a diversified energy structure within Canada. A lot of Canadians don't realize this. But between hydro, nuclear, like if you look at the Ontario power grid, almost, what is it, 60% of the energy, electricity in Ontario comes from nuclear, and it's a very successful program. We should be developing that. And so when we look at oil and gas sector in Canada, we have to look at it from the point of view of not just our country, but our continent with the United States in terms of continental energy security, but also from a world point of view. I was in the UK just 2 summers ago, and I met with a variety of decision makers, and it was fascinating because they had some understanding of the scale and scope of the energy sector in Canada. But we said, we could supply all of not only the UK's energy issues, but all of Europe. And this would be an incredible plus to not only supplying a continent that is under siege in many respects in terms of its energy security as we look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also in terms of the standard of living for our country. Can you imagine what it would be like if we doubled our energy production in Canada? What that would mean for every man, woman, and child in Canada. It would be a huge boon in terms of wealth. And instead of doing that, we are basically letting all those opportunities, including liquid natural gas, go to other countries, including the United States. So it's utterly stupid. So I can't underestimate how we are not serving not just Canadians in terms of our economy, but our environment. And a key thing I want to mention about the environment that you may not be aware of is that the largest polluters in Canada when it comes to our environment are communities that don't treat their wastewater. So there's communities, I know that they're working on it now, but the city of Victoria or Montreal or even Halifax a while ago, we're dumping, up until recently, their raw sewage into the ocean. And those kinds of surcharges happen in other contexts because of decaying infrastructure. And I saw this up close as a former mayor. So these are the things that we need to work at when it comes to improving our environment. We know the solutions are there. They're not some hypothetical thing based on an ethereal model that doesn't really work. So there's a lot that we can do about the environment, but we are not doing them.
Well, and that's and all of those are, I think, really hammering it home in that we need to be relying not on feelings, not on ideology, but on evidence-based solutions. Just to touch on nuclear recently, we're very strong proponents of nuclear. We're shocked and just completely confused that the Liberal government, who claims to be so pro-environment, are so anti-nuclear. When nuclear is, when you're talking about, just ratio of energy production to waste, it is by far the most energy efficient and least polluting technology out there. And the fact that we have some of the best nuclear engineers on the face of the planet, and some of the safest nuclear plants and cleanest burning nuclear plants on the safe face of the planet as well. We need to be leveraging and playing to our strengths. I was going to say something else.
Well, maybe I could just mention that what's fascinating is, and one of our associates at Frontier has written a very interesting book called Fossil Fuel Insanity. And one of the things he points out, further to our discussion, is that what's fascinating about the oil and gas industry in Canada is that it's among the best in the world. And it's like we're trying to penalize it. Of course, this federal government, a lot of Canadians don't realize, are trying to put it out of business, which is a huge mistake, and I would argue from an ethical point of view, utterly wrong. And what I think is fascinating is that they don't realize that the transitions to so-called alternative energy are, from a physics scientific point of view, impossible. And one of the examples is even the sourcing of precious metals is not possible within the time frames as outlined by all kinds of world agendas of net zero by 2030 or 2050. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you why. Because you can go back and source where these materials, these precious metals are from. And it takes a long time. It takes, on average, at least 10 to 20 years to establish these kinds of mines. And pardon me, I have a little bit of a cough here. The reality is that it takes a long cycle to implement those mines to be able to find those precious metals. And so the window of opportunity is not at all grounded with these fancy pronouncements of net zero by 2030. It's just simply out of the question. And this is the reality that a lot of decision makers don't want to talk about. So the real issue then is when we start losing our ability to further mine oil and gas in order to source that. The real issue is the large transition, and that will be from fission nuclear and oil and gas to another form of nuclear energy, namely fusion. That's really the big transition that we need to prepare for. And that, to me, should be one of the challenges that Canada should be on the forefront of, not ignoring it, but rather in plain sight saying, look, this could happen. We don't know whether it's in 25 years or 45 years, but that's what we need to prepare for.
Yeah, and you hear about these massive fusion projects in France and China and in Germany. They're competing. It seems like every week to establish new milestones in the efficiency, and it's an exciting area of physics and one that the scientific community is just desperate to master, because once we master fusion. The belief is that we are then very much close to limitless energy and solving a lot of these crises. But you mentioned time, and unfortunately we're out of time at this point, as the discussion has been very fruitful, and I'm sure everyone listening has enjoyed it so far. So where we want to end at is. Just a couple of questions. What keeps you going in the public policy sphere, and where can our viewers find you and the FCPP?
Well, it's a great question, and it's been delightful to talk with you, Cypher and Fox. Check out our website at www.fcpp.org and subscribe to our newsletter. Check out Leaders on the Frontier. Subscribe to that one. There are so many issues going on that are exciting at Frontier. And by the way, we do not accept any government funding. And so we're all sustained by donations. So our independence is very important. But I think what keeps us going is really that kind of support from people, but also we get so much encouragement across the country and around the world for the work that we're doing, because we're really one of the few independent voices that are speaking up, because we don't have anything to lose. We have everything to gain.
Well, and it sounds like Canada has a lot to gain from the recommendations coming out of the FCPP. It sounds like it's rooted in common sense and evidence, and as long as it's not tied to an ideology, that should be music to the ears of every Canadian that's listening. So thank you very much for joining us, David, and we'd love to have you on again in the future.
My pleasure, and all the best to everyone in 2024.